In this lesson, we're going to be looking at solving linear systems by substitution. So substitution, if you think of it in a sporting sense, if you see a player that gets substituted from a game, then he comes off the field and his substitution comes onto the field. And that's essentially what's happening here. So let's just look at an example because that is the best way for us to understand this. If we are given a linear system, that means we have to have two or more equations. And as I mentioned, we're really just going to look at two at a time. In the last lesson, we looked at what will happen or how to graph the lines in order to determine the solution. So the solution is your point of intersection. Here we're going to look at a method that does not require graphing. So for those of you who find the graphing tedious, this is a faster way to solve. Mind you, in an assessment, I will tell you whether you have to solve by graphing or not. So then if it says solve by graphing, you have to graph. Okay, so just make sure that you understand that. Okay, so here are our equations. If you notice, I numbered them, equation 1 and equation 2. That's a very helpful technique. I want you to adopt that, where you number them. And notice how I number them after I've written them out. They don't come in the front, they come afterwards, because the numbering is kind of secondary. And it is convention in math that when we have equations, we always number to the right of our equation. And that's why it's numbered like that. So I'm going to try to give this to you in kind of steps of how to solve for this. And so the first step is to look for the solved variable. Now, when we say solved variable in this context, we mean an equation that would either say y equals and then a whole bunch of stuff, or x equals and a whole bunch of stuff. So the y is solved for, or the x is solved for. It won't have an actual number value, but we know it just says y equals or x equals. If there isn't one, and we're going to look at that as an example later on, then we solve for it. And in the example I'm going to show you later on, I'm going to give you some hints on which equation to choose and which variable to solve for. And that is my shorthand for equations. Okay, so once we've done that, the next step is to substitute that value. So again, I'm going to show you all of this using the example we just looked at above. Now, step 3 is quite a long step. I'm just calling it solve the system, but you will see how that happens. Okay, so we have in our situation when we are looking at step 1, where step 1 says look for a solved variable, and I'm going to now create some spaces so you can kind of see all the steps as we go along. So step 1 is look for a solved variable. If there isn't one, then solve for the variable. If I look here, in my given system, I can already see that in equation 1, I already have y equals, all right? So I want you to adopt these little steps that I'm putting in where I put things in a different color so that you can see where it's coming from. So I'm going to say from 1, because this came from equation 1, we have y equals 2x. And so this is going to get substituted. And because it's just equation 1, so we're going to sub it into the other equation. Okay? So this goes in there. So I'm actually going to move this because now we're doing our substitution. So for us, I'm just going to put our little thought bubble here because this is really just, you don't have to write this out in your solution. I'm writing this so you can see what the thinking was. So in 1, we already have y equals. So we now can do our substitution. So what that means is in equation 2, wherever I see y, I now have to substitute 2x because that's what our substitution is. So equation 2 said negative 3x plus y, but now instead of saying y, we say 2x equals 12. And now we can solve. So here I'm going to change this step to say substitute. Substitute and solve the resulting equation. So here is our resulting equation, negative 3x plus 2x equals 12. I can solve that. That's going to tell me negative x equals 12, which means x equals negative 12. Okay, so that's x. Now we're going to solve the system. So what we do is this x value is going to sub back. And we could sub it, we have to sub it into equation 1. Because that's the easier equation. Equation 1 says y equals. So if I sub it into equation 1, I will immediately have y equals. And that's our solving of the system now. So the solving of the system requires another substitution where we sub back. So where we see x, we now replace it with the negative 12. So we have negative 24. And so our solution and that is the solution to the system. Okay, so I'm going to do one more example with you and then leave you with 2 examples to do on your own. And then we will look at those examples in class. Okay, so I'm going to just number these first. And then I'm going to see, do I have any of my equations where it says either x equals stuff or y equals? I don't have that. Now comes pick an equation where you're going to rearrange it so that it is in the form that we're looking for, where just one variable is isolated. And if we look at both of our equations, equation 2 has y all by itself, meaning there's no number in front of it. There's a 1, but what I mean is it's easier than if I isolated the y, I wouldn't have to do any division, which is what I'm looking for. I want the easier one. So now what we say is we say from 2, because this is where it's coming from. And we're going to say from 2, y equals, and then this will become, if I wanted to say y equals, then it becomes 6x plus 7. This came from 2, so we are going to renumber it. Even though it did come from 2, we're renumbering it equation 3, okay, just so that we treat it as something different. And then we're going to say sub 3 into, and now it can't go into 2 because that's where it came from. It has to go into 1. When we do that, everywhere where we see a y, we now replace it with 6x plus 7. Because that's what substitution means. You replace what you have with your substitute. Now we just solve. So this is going to be and that will be your x value. And then we take this x value, and this now we sub into our equation 3, because that would give me y. So wherever you see x, it gets replaced. And then you use your calculator, and that will give you your answer. Okay, so when we put that into our calculators, we will get y equals 19 over 10. And then that gives us our solution. Therefore, the solution is negative 17 over 20 and 19 over 10. So just to do a reminder on how to check this, when we check, you are checking if this point satisfies both the equations. I'm going to show you just to check for one, and then that will give you an idea of how to do the check for the other. So the first equation says 3y plus 2x equals 4. So the left-hand side is 3y plus 2x. The right-hand side is 4. And so when we check, we have to put in our values. So the y value is 19 over 10. And the x value is negative 17 over 20. And then just use your calculator. And the answer is 4. And so your left-hand side equals the right-hand side, so you know that this works for the first equation. And then you would do the same thing for the second. That's how you do a check. Okay, you don't have to do a check all the time. You only have to do a check if we ask you to do a check. But this is nice for yourself because you could always check your answers yourself and know if they work. Okay, so 2 examples I want you to do on your own, and then we will go through them tomorrow or in our class next lesson are these ones. So I'm just going to put them both here. I won't call it example A, I'll call it another one. So this will be example B because we did one already. Actually, we did two already. Let me call this one example C because we did one and another, yes. So let me call this example C. Equals -3 and negative x plus 4y equals -1. Okay, so those are the ones you need to do on your own, and then we will go through them in class, but make sure you do them on your own. Make sure you attempt them. You have the steps to follow along, so I'd like to see that you are trying to follow those steps, and then you scan all of this and submit it in the proper spot on Google Classroom.